Deeper into shadows, the following weeks in Vienna passed like scenes from a dream Catalina wasn't sure she wanted to wake from. What had begun as a professional meeting with Damien Rothschild had evolved into something far more complex and intoxicating. Each evening, after spending her days investigating the suspicious paintings that had brought her to the city, she found herself drawn back to his gallery. Then 2 intimate dinners at hidden restaurants only locals knew about. Damien was unlike anyone she'd ever met. He spoke 4 languages fluently, could discuss Renaissance techniques with the same passion he brought to analyzing contemporary installations, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people's emotions. When he looked at her, Catalina felt as though he could see past all her professional armor to something vulnerable and real underneath. "You're thinking too hard again," he said one evening as they walked through the Schönbrunn Palace gardens under a canopy of stars. The formal gardens were closed to tourists at this hour, but somehow Damien had arranged private access. "My job to think," Catalina replied, though she allowed him to take her hand. Even through his ever-present gloves, she could feel the warmth and strength of his fingers. "Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask you about something." She felt him tense slightly, though his expression remained relaxed. "Of course, what's troubling you? The Monet sketch in your collection, the one of the water lilies? I've been researching its provenance, and there's a gap in its ownership history between 1943 and 1987. 44 years is a long time for a piece to simply disappear." Damien stopped walking and turned to face her, his gray eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Many artworks went missing during the war, as you well know. Families fled, collections were scattered. Sometimes it takes decades for pieces to resurface. Through legitimate channels." His answer was smooth, practiced, but it didn't fully satisfy her journalist's instincts. "And the authentication documents? The paper looks too new, too perfect. Most documentation from that era shows some signs of aging." For just a moment, something flickered across Damien's face, a shadow of something that might have been fear, or perhaps calculation. Then his charming smile returned, and he stepped closer to her. "Catalina," he said softly, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Do you trust me?" The question caught her off guard. Did she trust him? Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings about the inconsistencies in his stories, the way he deflected certain questions, his mysterious past that he revealed only in carefully measured doses. But when he touched her like this, when he looked at her as though she were the most precious thing in his world, logic seemed to abandon her entirely. "I want to," she whispered honestly. "Then trust this," he murmured, leaning down to kiss her. The kiss was gentle at first, then deeper as she responded despite her reservations. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. The questions that had been troubling her seemed less important than the warmth of his arms around her. But as they walked back toward the city center, Catalina couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking deeper into something dangerous. The next morning, she made a decision that would change everything. She was going to investigate Damien Rothschild as thoroughly as she had investigated the suspicious paintings. Her heart might be compromised, but her professional integrity was still intact. What she would discover in the archives of Interpol's art crime database would shatter the romantic fantasy she'd been living and reveal the true identity of the man who'd stolen her heart along with priceless works of art from some of Europe's most prestigious museums. First impressions, the cobblestone streets of Vienna's old quarter gleamed under the soft glow of antique street lamps as Catalina Voss pulled her coat tighter against the autumn chill. Her leather portfolio, containing photographs of suspicious paintings that had been surfacing across Europe's underground art scene, felt heavier with each step toward the address she'd been given, a gallery tucked away in a narrow alley that most tourists would never find. Catalina had built her reputation as one of New York's most respected art authentication experts by trusting her instincts. And right now, those instincts were telling her that this case was bigger than anyone realized. 3 paintings, all supposedly lost masterpieces from different centuries, had appeared in private sales within the past 6 months. Each carried flawless provenance papers, yet something about them felt wrong to her trained eye. The galleries. Entrance was unmarked, except for a small brass plaque reading Rothschild Private Collection. Through the frosted glass windows, she could see warm light and the silhouettes of well-dressed figures moving among carefully positioned artworks. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the heavy wooden door. "Welcome," came a smooth voice with a slight accent she couldn't quite place. "You must be Ms. Voss." Catalina found herself looking into the most striking pair of gray eyes she'd ever seen. The man before her was tall, perhaps in his early 40s, with dark hair that showed distinguished silver at the temples.
But
Most were his hands, or rather, the elegant black leather gloves he wore despite being indoors. "Damien Rothschild," he said, extending one gloved hand. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I believe we have much to discuss about your current investigation." His handshake was firm, confident, and lasted just a moment longer than necessary. Catalina felt an unexpected flutter of attraction that she quickly suppressed. She was here on business, investigating what could be a major art fraud ring. "Mr. Rothschild," she replied professionally, "I appreciate you reaching out. Though I'm curious how you knew about my work here in Vienna." A mysterious smile played at the corners of his mouth. "In the art world, word travels quickly, especially about someone with your reputation. Please, let me show you why I wanted to meet." As he led her deeper into the gallery, Catalina couldn't help but notice how he moved graceful, almost predatory, like someone always aware of his surroundings. The space itself was breathtaking, filled with pieces that ranged from Renaissance sketches to contemporary sculptures. Everything was authentic, her expert eye confirmed. Yet the collection seemed impossibly comprehensive for a private dealer. "Quite remarkable," she murmured, pausing before a small Degas sketch she was certain should have been in a museum. "I've spent years building this collection," Damien said, moving to stand close beside her. "Each piece has a story, though not all of them are ... conventional." Confrontation and revelation, the gallery looked different in the harsh light of dawn. What had seemed romantic and mysterious in candlelight now appeared calculated, even sinister. Catalina stood across the street for nearly an hour, gathering the courage to cross those cobblestones that had seemed so charming just days before. The printouts from the Interpol database were folded in her jacket pocket, their edges worn from her nervous handling throughout the sleepless night. When she finally pushed through the gallery door, Damien Marcus was waiting for her, standing perfectly still in front of a painting she now recognized as one of his own forgeries. He looked older somehow, as though the weight of his deception had aged him overnight. His ever-present gloves were absent for the first time since she'd known him, revealing hands that bore faint scars across the knuckles. "You know," he said without turning around, "it wasn't a question." "Marcus Webb," she replied, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "Also known as the Glove. Wanted by Interpol for art theft, forgery, and fraud across 7 countries. He finally turned to face her, and she was startled to see genuine pain in his gray eyes. "And you know about Edmund Hartwell?" The mention of Eddie's name hit her like a physical blow. "You killed him. Maybe not with your hands, but you destroyed everything he'd built, everything he believed in. He couldn't live with the shame of having been fooled by your forgeries." "Yes," Marcus said simply. "I did, and I've lived with that guilt every day since I learned of his death." His honesty caught her off guard. She'd expected denials, explanations, anything but this stark admission of responsibility. "Eddie Hartwell was a good man," Marcus continued, moving closer but stopping when she instinctively stepped back. "One of the few dealers I encountered who genuinely loved art more than profit. When I learned that my actions had driven him to suicide, it broke something fundamental inside me. I disappeared not just to escape Interpol, but because I couldn't face what I'd become." "So you reinvented yourself as Damien Rothschild and continued dealing in stolen art?" "No." His voice was firm. "Every piece in this gallery was acquired legally. I spent 3 years learning legitimate channels, building authentic relationships with collectors and auction houses. The Damien Rothschild's identity wasn't created to continue my crimes, it was created so I could try to make amends for them." Catalina pulled the Interpol files from her pocket, her hands shaking with fury and confusion. "And what about me?" "Seducing Eddie's protege part of your redemption plan, some twisted way of evening the score." The pain that crossed Marcus's face looked genuine, but she no longer trusted her ability to read him. I didn't know who you were when we first met. By the time I realized you were Edmund Hartwell's student, I was already... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. I was already falling in love with you. Don't. The word came out sharper than she'd intended. Don't you dare claim to love me. Everything between us has been a lie. My name was a lie. My past was hidden. But what I feel for you, what we shared together, that was the most honest thing I've experienced in 15 years. Right. He took another step, toward her, then stopped when she raised her hand. Catalina, I know you have every right to hate me, to turn me in, to walk away and never look back. But I need you to know that meeting you changed me in ways I didn't think were possible. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. The problem was, she could see the truth in his eyes, or what looked like truth. But how could she trust her judgment about a man who'd built his entire criminal career on making people believe lies? Even if that's true, she whispered, how? Could we ever have anything real? Every time I looked at you, I'd think of Eddie. Every kiss would be tainted by what you did to him. Marcus nodded slowly, as though he'd expected this response. I understand. But before you make your decision about what happens next, there's something you need to see. Resolution and consequences. Marcus led her to a section of the gallery she'd never seen before, behind a hidden door that opened to reveal a smaller, more intimate space. The walls were lined with paintings, but these weren't for sale or display, were works in progress, studies, and most surprisingly, detailed forgeries of the very pieces that Marcus Webb had stolen years ago. What is this? Catalina asked, though part of her was already beginning to understand. My real work for the past 3 years, Marcus replied, his voice quiet with something that sounded like hope. Perfect recreations of every piece I stole, or had forged during my criminal career. I've been working with a network of lawyers and insurance companies to return them, anonymously to their rightful owners or the museums they were taken from. She moved closer to examine the paintings, her expert eye immediately recognizing the extraordinary skill involved. These weren't just good forgeries, they were perfect. Creations that captured not only the visual elements, but the emotional essence of the original works. The Monet sketch you questioned, Marcus continued, was returned to the Musée d'Orangerie 2 weeks ago, along with documentation proving its authenticity and explaining how it had been recovered. The insurance company that had paid out the claim donated the recovery reward to a scholarship fund for art students. Catalina turned to stare at him. You're trying to return everything you stole? Trying and succeeding? 63 pieces have been returned so far. There are 47 more in progress. He gestured toward the works surrounding them. It's taken me years to track down some of the original pieces, to study them long enough to create perfect recreations. Some I've had to purchase from private collectors at enormous costs just to ensure they could be returned to public institutions. But why? The question came out barely above a whisper. Could have disappeared completely, started fresh somewhere. Else, why risk exposure by trying to make amends? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. His scarred hands clasped behind his back as he studied one of his recreations, a small Picasso sketch that she recognized from the list of pieces. Stolen from a Barcelona museum in 2017, because I realized that loving art means protecting it, preserving it for future generations. Everything I had done was the opposite of love. It was possession, theft, a corruption of something beautiful. He looked at her directly then. Meeting you reminded me why I fell in love with art in the first place. Watching you work, seeing the respect and reverence you have for these creations, it made me want to be worthy of that same respect. Catalina felt tears she hadn't expected burning behind her eyes. Eddie would have wanted to see the stolen works returned. I know, and I hope that someday, when all the pieces have been returned, his reputation might be partially restored. The art world will know that the forgeries in his gallery weren't the result of his poor judgment, but the work of someone skilled enough to fool anyone. She stood there in the hidden room, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of recreated masterpieces, trying to process everything she'd learned. The man she'd fallen in love with was both a criminal and someone trying to atone for his crimes. He'd destroyed her mentor's life, but was working to restore his reputation. He'd lied to her about his identity, but had been honest about his feelings. "Happens now?" she asked finally. Marcus pulled a cell phone from his pocket and held it out to her. "That's entirely your decision. Interpol's number is already programmed in. One call, and Marcus Webb's career as a free man ends. I won't run, won't resist. I've been prepared for this possibility since the day I decided to try to make things right." Catalina took the phone, feeling its weight in her palm. Justice demanded that she'll make the call. Her loyalty to Eddie's memory demanded it. But her heart, her traitorous, confused heart, demanded something else entirely. "Or," she whispered, "or we find a way forward together. I continue returning the stolen art, working to repair the damage I've done. You continue your work as an authentication expert, helping to preserve legitimate art for the world. And we see if two broken people can build something honest and real despite the lies that brought us together." 3 months later, Catalina stood in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris, watching as the museum's director unveiled a small Renoir that had been missing for over a decade. The plaque beside it read, "Returned through the generous efforts of an anonymous benefactor dedicated to preserving art for future generations." In the crowd, she spotted a familiar figure in elegant gloves, watching the ceremony with quiet satisfaction. Their eyes met across the room, and Marcus, who was slowly, carefully, becoming Damien in truth as well as name, smiled at her with an expression that held both gratitude and love. The decision she'd made that morning in Vienna hadn't been about forgiveness or justice. It had been about the possibility of redemption, both for him and for herself. They still had work 2 to 47 pieces left to return, and a relationship to build on a foundation of honesty rather than deception. But as she watched children gaze up at the returned Renoir with wonder, Catalina thought that maybe, sometimes, love really could transform even the most broken of people into something beautiful. The phone call to Interpol remained unmade. Justice was being served in its own way, one returned masterpiece at a time. Unraveling truth, the revelation came at 3 in the morning when Catalina's bleary eyes finally focused on the photograph that would destroy everything she thought she knew about love, trust, and the man she'd fallen for. The Interpol database had been reluctant to give up its secrets, but her credentials and persistent digging had finally granted her access to files marked Confidential, International Art Theft Ring Operation Renaissance. The face staring back at her from the computer screen was unmistakably Damien's, though the name beneath read Marcus Webb, also known as the Glove Master Art Forger and primary suspect in the 2018 Bellecourti Museum heist. Her hands trembled. As she clicked through the files, Marcus Webb had been the mastermind behind one of the most sophisticated art theft operations in European history. Using his expertise in art authentication and restoration, he had created an elaborate network of forgers, thieves, and corrupt dealers that had operated across 7 countries for nearly a decade. The nickname The Glove came from his signature. He never left fingerprints, always wore gloves, and had never been photographed without them. The worst revelation was yet to come. Among the casualties of Webb's operation was the prestigious Hartwell Gallery in London, run by renowned art dealer Edmund Hartwell. The gallery had been destroyed financially when it was revealed that nearly 30% of their collection consisted of Webb's forgeries, sold with authentication documents so perfect that even experts had been fooled for years. The scandal had ruined Hartwell's reputation and led to his suicide just 6 months after the truth came out. Edmund Hartwell Eddy, to his friends and family, had been Catalina's mentor, the man who'd taught her everything she knew about art authentication, the man who'd inspired her career, who'd treated her like the daughter he'd never had, who'd believed in her talent when no one else would. Eddie, whose death had devastated her so completely that she'd thrown herself into her work to avoid dealing with the grief. The coffee mug slipped from Catalina's numb fingers, shattering on the hotel room floor as the full implications hit her. The man she'd been kissing, sleeping with, falling in love with, was directly responsible for her mentor's death. Every tender moment, every passionate night, every whispered promise had been built on a foundation of lies and blood. But there, was more. According to the files, Marcus Webb had disappeared completely after the Hartwell Gallery scandal broke. Interpol believed he'd undergone plastic surgery and created a new identity, but they'd never been able to prove it or track him down. Until now. The 3 suspicious paintings that had brought Catalina to Vienna, they weren't random finds. They were breadcrumbs, carefully placed to draw one of the world's best authentication experts to a specific place at a specific time. She'd been played from the very beginning. With shaking hands, Catalina reached for her phone. She should call Interpol immediately, report that she'd found Marcus Webb. It was her duty, her obligation to the art world, and to Eddie's memory. But as her finger hovered over the numbers, images flashed through her mind. Damien's gentle smile. When he thought she wasn't looking, the way he'd held her during a thunderstorm 3 nights ago. His passionate defense of art as humanity's greatest achievement. Was it possible that people could truly change? That a criminal could become someone capable of genuine love? Or was even this moment of doubt exactly what he'd been counting on when he'd orchestrated their meeting? The questions tortured her until dawn broke over Vienna's ancient skyline, and she knew there was only one way to get answers. She had to confront the man she'd thought was Damien Rothschild and demand the truth from Marcus Webb.